morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to this webinar, How to Learn and Continuously Improve Your Strategy. I'm Kien Lee, Vice President of Consulting at Community Science.
And I'm Suprotik Stotz-Ghosh. You're all welcome to call me Teak if we get into a conversation, and serve as Principal Associate at Community Science.
Want to introduce you to Community Science. We are a research and development organization that works with governments, foundations, and nonprofit organizations on solutions to social problems through community and other systemic changes that really center equity. We are also a wholly owned subsidiary of BCT Partners. So today's takeaway, we want to really talk about why strategy and learning are more necessary now than ever, how equity-centered continuous learning and strategy improvement prepares for turbulence in equity work, and tools to increase organizational learning. We often talk about evaluation, learning, and continuous strategy improvement. I feel that we don't pay enough attention to the learning part of it, especially when the learning not only involves what insights are generated from the evaluation findings, but also how we learn to apply an equity lens. How do we learn to improve our muscle for talking about, systemic inequities, racism, sexism, classism, and all other sort of inequities that affect the process in how we interact with one another and work, as well as the work itself and the outcomes. And so today is a webinar that we wanted to do to share more about that learning part of it. And I'm excited to have my colleague here, Teak, to share some of that. We did our introductions, introduced you to community science, and talked about the key takeaways. We're gonna set the context and the framework for evaluation, learning, and continuous improvement. And then Teak's going to take over and talk a little bit about some of the learning tools he's used in his work. And then we'll open up for questions and answers. So why now? Why did we feel that we have to do this webinar? Because we really think that this is an important time for equity and social justice, and that in order to continuously make progress towards equity and justice, we have to learn, be able to adjust, and be okay with not getting it perfect the first time. So really, when we talk about learning and continuous improvement, we're referring to the best questions at this time that we should be asking and that we can try to answer. The data available at this time, even if the data is imperfect, and the learning environment that we can create that encourages experimenting and adjusting. So that's what we mean by continuous improvement. Why now? We find that a focus on strategy, on equity requires strategy and a commitment to learning despite the headwinds and turbulence. So as the image here implies, there's a lot of turbulence. And so in order to learn and develop that muscle for learning and doing better is something that we have to keep practicing. The speed of change requires imperfect data to support real-time learning to emerging issues. Again, even as evaluators, we're always looking for that perfect data, the complete data, but we have to understand that if we want to have real-time learning, we have to live with imperfect data and incomplete data. And if we have too much flexibility, we'll not be able to answer critical strategic questions, leaving people without a pathway or map to keep moving forward. So instead of having flexibility, what we need to do is have a learning process in place. I want to first introduce us to this learning and continuous improvement a framework that we have, which is, for most of you, if you are evaluators, you'll know that this is nothing new. You plan, and when you're planning, in order to have it centered on equity, you're applying a systems lens and you're making your assumptions explicit. That's underneath what we do when we're trying to create theories of change, and then being able to navigate the power dynamics as we're developing that theory of change. And then we're designing the evaluation, and then we'll redesign it after we've been through one iteration of, collecting the data, analyzing the data, learning from it, and then coming back to improve the strategy. Then there's the implementation process, as we know. Then there's the, what are the outcomes that we're going to be able to capture? And then based on that, reflecting on on the data and on the findings, and really asking the question, so what? And then using that learning to be able to come back and redesign and improve the strategy. But learning doesn't just occur at the reflection and learning box, right? It occurs throughout the whole process, and we have to know what that learning process is like from the start. This next diagram that I'm going to share is the same diagram, except that it has more details in it, and it really centers equity. So as we're planning and applying the systems lens, there are a lot of questions that we should be asking. What is unfair? What is unjust, and for whom? What are the root causes of disparities that we're trying to eliminate? What are the harmful narratives that are still in place that even if we either have to shift or we have to be aware of, and how it affects the work? Who has power here to push and pull the levers of change? So you can have a learning and continuous strategy improvement, but if you have one that's really centered on equity, there are these questions that we have to ask along the way and be very intentional about asking. This will obviously inform the theory of change, and we in the process have to learn about the systems, the levers of change, and the power dynamics that are at play. And then the next set of questions as we're designing the evaluation is all about, well, what are the outcomes we can achieve? What are all those potential scenarios that are, successful scenarios, failure? What does that look like? And how does it affect everybody who's involved in the work? And does everyone have equitable access to resources, opportunities, and support to be successful? Again, there's a lot of learning that can happen here if you ask the question, like, what do you need to be successful? And grantees can say, I need X, I need to learn about Y. Well, that's all part of that learning process that needs to be continuous here. And then you're able to hone the theory of change, ask the appropriate evaluation questions at the time, create a learning agenda and the measurement framework. You go about collecting the data, but here there are questions to ask. Is there sufficient capacity to successfully implement the strategy? Are the data collection instruments and activities contextually and culturally appropriate? Again, learning can occur here as we try to understand what is contextually and culturally appropriate in this situation. So besides the actual implementation of the work, there's also the learning process as we're trying to design the instruments and design the evaluation. You're collecting the data, and as you're collecting the data, you've got two paths, the outcomes. You're going to look at the outcomes that are occurring as a result of the strategy. What are intended, unintended outcomes? And even here, we may be learning about unintended outcomes that we didn't anticipate in the beginning. And then we go to how do we reflect and learn from the data, the findings, and everything. And we're asking key questions here. Whose story is it to tell? How does context, history, and power affect the outcomes? Who's communicating the findings? Why are these the right messengers to communicate the finding? There are layers of learning that's happening here both from the findings, from the process, from what we have to do next. And then as we continue, coming back to redesigning the strategy. So this really, sharing this to really emphasize how learning is happening throughout the whole thing, not just learning from the evaluation findings at the end. And it's with multiple groups of stakeholders on different levels. So with that, I'm actually going to turn this over to my colleague Teek to take us into some of the learning tools he's used to help support learning throughout the entire process.
Thanks, Kien. So my job is to introduce a handful of tools, and this is some of my most fun conversations. So I've been spending the last most of the last 2 decades on strategy, continuous improvement, and learning processes. And so what I'm sharing here are some of the tools that have helped make that process that Kien just introduced more supportive of learning. And so what I'm starting with here are 2 tools that focus on the transformational change process. Now, most strategies are a process of transformation. And then especially for those of us who are engaged in processes that are trying to center equity, you're definitely in a transformational change process. And so what this tool tries to do is lay out, well, what does this look like? This comes from Living Systems. So I'm just going to quickly walk through this tool and then tell you how I've been using it. So first is birth of a new idea, right? Birth of a new strategy, a new way of being, a new North Star. As you implement that, there's an increase in energy. That's why the line goes up until stage 2, where there's a plateau. And the plateau is where things start to get complicated. There's a lack of knowing, exactly what to do next. But then in stage 3, if you're able to keep proceeding in this, it doesn't always feel good. That's why it's visualized by a descent, but it is a period of chaos. The period of chaos is characterized by when you're experimenting, doing a lot of new things, and you're trying to figure out how to act in this new way in alignment with the new strategy. But at the same time, you're holding on to all the behaviors and culture of the existing organization. So it is a period of serious disruption. The next stage is called the pit. You know you're in the pit when you are able to name what are the behaviors and what are the cultural aspects, the paradigms that we need to let go of. And so that's why stage 5 called letting go. And when you start letting go of the prior way of being, then you're creating the room and space for this period of reemergence and leading towards this period of integration, stage 7. And the integration is kind of often what people say is the new normal, where you are actually being that new organization that you envisioned in stage 1, of course, is likely very different than what you were imagining when you were at the beginning point. But the way I've used this tool is to just kind of place yourself, right? When you're doing transformational work, it's very easy to get lost. And so this tool is one way that I've been able to, as both as an individual and as, within teams or organizations, to ask people, engage in conversation about where do you think we are? And that data can then help you understand why there might be different ideas about what's next, about what work is most important. But when I introduce this tool, often I find organizations are coming because they feel like they're in the pit. Mm. And when I'm able to ask the question about, like, okay, if you're at the pit, what are you ready to let go of? And if they can't name that, what is required then is actually more work to figure out, okay, what's needed to help us move forward, right? This is where leaders really have an important job in terms of clarifying stage 7. What are we trying to move towards? But when organizations can name the paradigms, it's that need to be let go of, the behaviors, the strategies that need to let go in favor of what's new, that's when things can start to reemerge. Another dynamic that I often see when using this tool is organizations that would never say it, would never necessarily know it, but are trying to jump from stage 2 to stage 7. Mm. Often in organizations or places like this, what you'll find is an emphasis on the communications of the change. And what is often the case is that there's teams that, potentially those who have more power are less experienced in the really hard process of going through stages 3, 4, 5, and 6. But there's usually people who know in the organizations that we're just saying we've changed, and yet the systems very much feel the same, but maybe under a new header. So that's just using 7 stages as a way to locate yourself. The next slide talks about just a different way of looking at transformational change. And this comes from Crossroads Anti-Racism. It's been adapted by Aorta. So you can get, this is publicly available. But this just talks about 6 different stages of a transformational change process, organizations trying to integrate anti-racism, equity practices into the organization. And I also use this as a way to locate yourself. So what I wanted to do is just read a few statements from a few different stages. And maybe you can get a sense of how you could use this. So for example, in the tokenizing institution, which of course we all know we don't really want to be a part of, right? There's been enough work in this area of integrating equity, doing anti-racism work. It's hard to believe that we might be in a tokenizing stage. But this is the stage where an organization might declare, we don't have a problem, as a way to silence critiques of oppressive dynamics. As organizations grow from tokenizing to compliance, an organization might see itself as non-oppressive an institution with open doors to all, yet at the same time, there's little or no change to the culture, policies, or decision making. And yet, even in an affirming institution, an organization has now developed an analysis of systemic oppression. It's beginning to integrate anti-oppressive policies into their work, begins to develop accountable relationships to oppressed communities even. But even in the affirming institution, according to this tool, the institutional structures and culture that maintain power and privilege are critiqued, but still remain intact and relatively untouched. So often I pull out this tool after I've been engaged in a lot of work just to remind myself of like, okay, where are we? And then it helps me ground myself. And you try to do, when we're doing equity work, we're trying to do this work without illusion, to really know where we are so we can know what growth in 6 or 12 months is we can expect, right? Or what's the next step we're trying to look for. So there's a couple of tools to help support transformational change. We'll go to the next slide. We'll focus on the learning environment. So this tool comes from the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award. And some of you might be familiar with the Baldrige Performance Excellence Framework. So this book is incredibly thick. It's an incredible process I've been trained in, and I wouldn't really recommend people take up this whole thing. It's overwhelming for most organizations. But like I did with all of these different tools, what I'm trying to do is introduce tools that are complex, but try to pull out pieces of them that can be made simple. And what I feel like is, as I was preparing this presentation, is like that is really a tactic to respond to the overwhelm that so many people are feeling, to the overwhelm in terms of the work, all the different distractions, and how difficult it is to get our organizations to be involved in learning processes, to pull out pieces that can be made simple. So in this case, from the Baldrige process, I'm focusing on two key questions. One is your organization doing things right? So this is, in a lot of cases, and for those of you who filled out some of the questions in our registration, we learned that a lot of you have data, right? You are answering this question in terms of how are we doing on our strategies, right? What are the results that we're getting? And we know it takes an enormous amount of work for you to collect the data, to look at it, analyze it, and then ideally, right, some of you are actually able to use the data, right, and inform decision-making using that. And we know it takes an enormous amount of time and effort to answer this first question. But what I wanted to introduce, which I think is a question that's equally as important, is your organization doing the right things, right? So this is more of a reflection, a zoom out on the big picture question that is more of a way to check on the entire strategy, right? So it takes even more time, but also I think a lot of courage, right? We all know how much time we've taken on our theories of change. But for organizations asking both of these questions now, this is how we can get to feeling like we're doing more real-time learning. So an example, to share a story, is of when these two questions really became apparent to me, how important they are, was when I was part of a Cradle to Career initiative and trying to bring together all the educational systems in a county, trying to address inequities in student outcomes. And exciting work, incredibly challenging work, absolutely transformational work. And one of the big challenges that we had was keeping the largest school district, where the largest inequities in performance were present, keeping them at the table. And so at some point, a little bit into this initiative, a group of leaders decided we're going to keep moving the initiative forward without the largest district at the table. So really hard political decision, but after a couple of years, this group actually was achieving some meaningful results. So when we looked at the evaluation in terms of are we doing things right, there were lots of different metrics in terms of new levels of collaboration across the districts. One student outcome especially was increasing in terms of college access. So there were lots of different data points that we were looking at to say, yep, we're doing things right. When it came time for the next wave of funding, that's when we had to confront the second question of like, are we doing the right things? And that prompted us to really recognize that we missed the boat on addressing the center of equity in this initiative, which was at the largest school district. And sadly, this really did that reflection, that period led to the end of this initiative. So that's my very humble lesson in terms of like knowing how important asking these both questions are. So we're not just focusing on the smaller picture. Another tool I want to introduce to help support the learning environment. This is focused on the idea of flow. Flow is the idea of peak performance, the idea of being in the zone, and the researcher who did the most on this, that at least I'm aware of, is this referenced here, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. And in this first book, interviewed, this is the second book. In the first book, interviewed a lot of artists and professionals at the top of their field, and athletes, and tried to understand what is flow. In the second book, named these 8 elements and then applied it to organizations. And so I use these 8 elements as a kind of checklist. And I believe that a flow experience is an equitable experience. And I'll explain that a little bit more. But when I'm designing learning environments, these are the elements I'm trying to pay attention to. But I want to focus in on one. Again, like you can focus on all 8, but in the current environment, I want to focus on one. And this idea of balance between opportunity and capacity. And what this means is like it's so critical as we're trying to lead strategies, as we're trying to support learning, is the work in front of the people who are leading the change, balance between the opportunity and the capacity. So is a flow experience is one that is not too easy, not too hard, is an experience that is stretching people. It is in a growth zone. And it takes a lot of time to really understand, well, what is that work that the team that's in front of me is capable of taking on and is stretching them, but not beyond their capacity. So it makes me think about, how often our strategies are appropriately super ambitious, but maybe not, the strategies right in front of us at the moment are maybe not balanced between the opportunity and capacity. A couple of just quick stories where I was trying to apply the idea of flow was when I was leading a community investment strategy at a foundation, and we had an innovation fund, and where in reflection really was out of flow, not a good balance between opportunity and capacity, was where we made an investment in a small nonprofit that had been growing, but we both thought that they were ready for a grant that was going to more than double their budget. Unfortunately, that opportunity did not match their capacity. And so that led to a really difficult period of learning, both for us and for the organization. On a more positive side, there was a emergency food, a food pantry organization that had been really growing their emergency food services, responding to the incredible increase in the need, but would still always talk about how their mission was to solve hunger. Yet they weren't able to spend any time on that. And so what we did was engage in a process that would provide funding as well as supports, where they could start to explore and figure out, how do we manage the day-to-day of providing emergency food and start to explore solving hunger. So now I don't have the story to say that the community has solved hunger, but the organization is still in a process of learning how to grow their capacity, which we really require just a new level of partnerships, new people around the table, a different board, different staff capacity, which they're still trying to build. So in that case, I look at this idea of flow, where the opportunity in front of that group was a good balance between opportunity and capacity. Next, I want to touch on for the people who are leading the change. I've come to be a believer in coaching. And part of the reason is that I want to touch on this visual, which is that I think often feel like the people who are leading change processes, especially when we're trying to center equity, are trying to grow something in really harsh conditions, right? Where we are these plants in a desert and so hungry for food and nourishment, right? But we're still doing it. We're still trying to grow. And for me, I was initially resistant to coaching. I've now become a believer, and to the point where I'm a certified coach. But part of it is because I've come to learn that coaching really is for the workplace. And what I mean by that is we are struggling, especially these organizations who are trying to lead change, lead equitable change in this current environment. And coaching supports action. Coaching provides direct support to people, but to figure out, what is my next step? And I say here, coaching is not therapy and not consulting. I myself, and then I've come across a lot of people who are confusing that. And in the certification process I went through, really learned therapy is its own thing, consulting is its own thing, and coaching is focused on action in the workplace in a different way than the other two. So nothing wrong with therapy, nothing wrong with consulting, right? But they are distinct. And I think that for those people who are leading change, it's so important to be able to acknowledge the challenges that we're facing and do it in a supportive way. And I do think that that's what coaching does. And there's no better way to demonstrate to the people who are leading that you're trying to grow the people who are growing the strategy by providing this kind of support. So overall, like pay attention. It's an encouragement to pay attention to the environment that people are in and figure out what kind of environment do we have and how do we provide more support to the people who are leading the change. Last, just want to lift up a couple of other tools. Won't spend any time on it, but I'm a big fan of the Intercultural Development Inventory, the IDI. Some people know about that. I think it's important to pay attention to how you're making decisions. And there's a way to do consensus in a way that is mobilizing, doesn't take too much time. And to me is very much aligned with an equity culture. There's many tools on listening and feedback. Every organization I've been a part of needs to grow in that area, us included at Community Science. And then as I've gotten deeper into the equity work, the tools around truth and reconciliation processes have become more and more important. And while I've been focusing on tools, I could have put a tool belt here as the visual, but what I realized is that the organizations we're a part of are really not machines, right? They are living organisms. And what we're really trying to do here is introduce new ingredients, right? So these tools can be ingredients and encourage you to keep adding, right? So this idea of like, well, what tools do you have? And to keep bringing more, but sometimes it's also not necessarily more ingredients. It's like, we heard from people saying like, we have the data we need, but then how do you use the ingredients you have more intentionally, right? And actually maybe hold back on other ingredients. So just offer that as potentially a metaphor where we become chefs. I'm not a chef myself, but I like this metaphor better than a tool person, a repair person with tools. So then last, just to apply all these things real quickly. If we come back to the slide that Kien introduced, my encouragement is to think about, especially when you're in the planning stage and in the design and improve stage, is to figure out how do I integrate location, thinking about the two transformation tools, like where are we in our stage of growth and evolution, and how do I make sure that I'm applying a more specific awareness of where we are to what the strategy is that we're planning and designing. When it comes to reflect and learn, make sure that you are asking both questions about how we're doing on our results and are we even working on the right strategies. And then overall, again, I just think like we can be curators of flow experiences at every stage, right? As Kien mentioned, like we're trying to foster learning throughout. So how can I think about, how can I apply this idea of flow? And then when you're stuck, right? And many of us are at different moments. You might be, or many of us are invested in coaching, but just want to lift that up as another way to help support more positive action. And with that, Kien, pass it back to you. You have some more thoughts to keep in mind?
Yeah, thanks, Teek. So what I want to share, this kind of closing remarks, is that there is no magic one to, a good learning process and system that centers equity. There is no checklist that you can go through and say, yep, we have this learning system, and yes, we have all of these things in place for equity. It's the little things that actually are not so little, because it takes time and resources, and it really takes intentionality. So all the things that, Teek asked, even that one slide about, are we doing the right thing? And are we doing things right? I mean, even those two questions, as simple as they sound, takes energy, time, focus and intentionality to slow it down to ask those questions. And in the process of asking these questions, there will always be resistance, whether that resistance is intentional or not. And so all you can do is be as ready as you can be. Because just when you think you're ready and you're able to take it on, a roadblock will come up, and you'll realize, oh, wish we had thought of that. and you can't think of everything, right? Part of the letting go as well, I think that Teague talked about. There's not a beginning or an end to integrating equity into evaluation and the learning process. You will not get everything right the first time. A lot of our consultancy and our coaching, we've really come to this conclusion that people want to get it right the first time because the stakes are so high, but it's really difficult. We operate in dynamic environments. There are all kinds of factors internally in an organization, externally in our world, that affects how we do something, what we do, and how successful we are. So we won't get it right the first time. But the most important thing, not getting it right, but actually pausing, reflecting, learning, and improving it the next time, so that we are continuously strengthening this muscle to fight inequities and to advance towards equity, better and better each time. And it will take all of us to change structures, practices, habits, and mental models. As an evaluator, Teague as a facilitator, as a strategist, none of us can do this alone. We need one another. We need other structures around us to also change, which kind of goes back to, you will not get everything right the first time because there'll be other things that affect what you're doing. You can only be as ready as you can be. So these are just some of the big lessons we've learned through our work. And we've really been trying to share this more and more so that people don't get paralyzed when they're in the middle of something that they're trying to change, especially when we're in the middle of transformational type changes. So with this, I'm going to end and see if there are questions for us. I think there is I'm actually going to stop sharing. Great. There is a Q&A box that you can drop your questions in there. So we'll give it a couple of seconds if anybody has any questions. If not, we also had some questions that we got from participants who registered for this webinar. I'll throw out the first question that we got from the webinar registration. How do we ensure that relevant lessons or insights are shared across issues areas at our organization? And it's not isolated to a single individual or team. What motivates staff to engage, right, in learning with one another? Teague, I don't know if if you have thoughts. I'm sure you've worked with lots of organizations and even inside philanthropy and nonprofits with multiple issue areas.
So I'll say a few thoughts, and then I think those listening would appreciate your thoughts as well. One, this is a real issue. So you're definitely not alone. I do think sharing learning is typically kept isolated. And well, then why is that? I think it's these organizations are kept isolated, and in a lot of cases just because they are what should we say? All the dynamics of inequity are taking place within organizations as well, which keeps knowledge and learning isolated. So then, in terms of breaking through that, I think it's a matter of two things. One is mobilizing inside, in terms of there are likely people across the organization who are very hungry to share. And so how do we find those people? And so generally starting small. I do think in all organizations I've been a part of or have worked with, there are people who really do want to be part of learning processes and know that the organization can be more effective. And so starting small in terms of, whether it's just informal and figuring out that, how does the organization become better? So there's one thing, just like, I call that, that's some form of mobilizing. But then two, if the learning that is happening across the organization isn't being captured in any way, it seems to me that there's a big misalignment in terms of where the strategies that are named and the learning that's taking place. So whether that means lifting up more the real-time learning that is taking place needs to happen, or understanding, well, the learning needs to be more aligned to the strategies, right? So the misalignment to me seems like an indicator of strategies that aren't supporting learning.
I'll add to that a little bit. I think there's something that we aren't saying here that that has a huge implication on how much learning happens in an organization, which is leadership buy-in and role modeling by leadership. I've worked with an organization whose leaders actually were pretty clear that they didn't value the evaluation data. It wasn't going to make a big difference to the decisions they made. And then you have the evaluation and learning staff running in circles because they're trying to do their best to bring insights into the work. And in that instance, I felt that the team could only do what it could do. And at that point, I think, where is it in that flow and that transformation process, Teak, that you showed, right? It almost felt like they were in the pit because the organization's leadership was not supportive of learning. So it's like you have to come out of that, and a lot has to change. A big transformation has to change for leadership to say we value the learning, right? Otherwise, it's just getting data for the sake of getting data. So to me, leadership buy-in and support is really key. Then I think if you have leadership that's really bought into it and is supportive of learning, then to me, it's how do you create a process that's very intentional about bringing people together? So each team can learn, but then you have a broader agenda for what each team can help the other team learn. And you actually design a process where you bring everybody together to share, but it's a very structured learning process. I think it's possible. I've seen organizations do it. You have to put it on the calendar ahead of time because you know how everybody's schedules fill up very quickly. So you got to make sure it's on the calendar. Leadership has to say you have to be there. And there has to be some prep work so that when everyone comes in, it's structured, it's clear, and it's well facilitated. There's a question in the chat about you want to be inclusive in the learning process, right? So I think interpretation of data about change is key. How do you decide who should be at the table when thinking about interpretation? You want to be inclusive, but everyone can't be in the room. I'll start, and then hopefully, Tick, you can add. I think it starts with a very clear understanding of who needs to help interpret the data, why do they need to be at the table to help interpret the data, and how best to engage them, right? So it's we've done this in evaluations, kind of creating a matrix around stakeholder engagement, and a stakeholder engagement plan should be very clear about like which stakeholder, what are they bringing, why do we need them, and what's the best way to engage them. And not everybody needs to be engaged the same way to interpret the data. And I think, it's almost like a concentric circle as you think about who you're bringing in more and more, but you're bringing them in different ways. So they don't all have to be in the same room at one time. And they don't all have to try and interpret the data with the same lens. You're really getting people to bring their lens, their lived experience into the room to interpret the data a certain way. And then your job is to look at the whole thing and all the different forms of interpretation and then make sense of it. That's how I think about it. Teak, any
That's excellent. No, I love all that. The only thing I would add is how is the decision making going? Meaning, like, what is the input? What is it all leading to? So making sure that there's some connection to the input, and what role does the input have with the final decision? I think that can also just help shape everything we're talking about. Like, what's the purpose of the engagement?
Thank you for bringing that up. I think that is so important because that question about what is the decision, and in my way of saying about it is how much power does each stakeholder group have to impact that decision? Because you don't want to bring people in the room to interpret and then realize that the interpretation doesn't matter at the end. Like that's the worst thing we can do to people, right? That creates more harm than good. And so I appreciate you bringing that up, because we don't clarify that in front. And I've worked with a lot of organizations that come in and in wanting to be inclusive, is just jumping straight to like, let's bring everybody to help co-interpret and be inclusive, but not thinking even more ahead of that, which is like, yeah, is their information and their input going to make a difference? Because if not, then don't set them up for coming in and thinking that their input will make a difference. That's the step we miss a lot. Yeah. Another question in the Q&A is, what if we don't have the data to know if you're doing the right thing, and there are insurmountable barriers that prevent you from collecting the data you need? What if you don't have the data to know if you're doing the right thing, and there are insurmountable barriers that prevent you from collecting the data you need?
That's tough.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
That's tough. So, I mean, the insurmountable barriers to me, what I hear is something you mentioned earlier, is leadership, right? That's where I first go, is like, what is the environment for openness, and where leadership is open to overcoming those barriers. So if those aren't the conditions where leadership is open, yeah, that's tough. And if we're in pursuit of equity, we are in a constant struggle. And so what I do believe is that there are other data sources, right? And so, well, what does that mean? It just means that these organizations we're a part of have been gathering data in certain ways for periods of time. And equity does push us into saying, like, well, how else do we know? And just to follow that path of how else do we know is the kind of, you're breaking outside of the institution's experience, which of course then can create more challenge inside. But the point to me is, like, if we're pursuing equity, we are willing to push those. We are required to keep pushing on those boundaries for answering how do we know and how do we get different data sources. So it's a process. It's a process of experimenting. It's a process of trying new things. But if there is insurmountable barriers, that says to me, like, we have to find a different way, or like it really questions the overall purpose of whatever learning process you're currently a part of.
That's a great point. So what I heard you say was, there's a question in here that we have to ask, which is, what are the different ways of knowing, and that collecting data may not be the only way. So what are other ways of knowing, and being open to that? There's also the question of, what are the insurmountable barriers? There might be a deeper question there, right? Why are those barriers? Like, so what are these barriers in place because people are afraid of the lessons they'll learn, or the knowledge they'll gain, or just not into the learning, or don't believe the learning? So this question seems to have more questions underneath it. I will share
say, let's talk, right?
Yeah, let's talk. One of my experiences with an organization is how they told us that the only data we have is whatever came through the progress reports, and that we were not allowed to go collect more data from the grantees, for fear of putting additional burden on the grantees. That set us up for a couple of problems. One is that it was impossible for us to answer the evaluation questions because we didn't have complete data. And so learning was very limited. And I found myself having to be really clear and explicit about that with the funder, to say, your learning is going to be limited because we have only so much data, and the quality of data doesn't allow us to be able to go deeper. I think the second thing is that there was no conversation that happened with the grantees about how much data do they want to provide and how much learning they want to be part of. So it was just assumed that it would be burdensome. When I've also often heard from nonprofit organizations that are funded by the funders who will say, like, well, why didn't you come talk to us? Why didn't you interview us? Why didn't you come visit us? And I feel that we're stuck with the answer of, well, we weren't allowed to because the funder felt that it was overburdensome. So that to me is a real thing that I've definitely encountered in our work. I want to come back to a question that was in the registration that connects back to what we've been saying, Teak. How do you engage leadership to buy into establishing a culture of learning? I think we talked about leadership buy-ins being so key. I think this question is really good. How do we engage leadership to buy into learning?
Yeah. So this is where a really important set of questions at the start of a strategy process, meaning like whenever you're putting a strategy in place, you are calling for a significant change in the organization. And so a really important question as part of this, well, what do we need to learn in order to accomplish that? And so at any point in the strategy, but in all cases, right, there's, where you're starting, the current capacities are generally insufficient to accomplish the goals of the strategy. So having that conversation about what do we need to learn, what capabilities do we need to bring in, is an important, ground setting, right? This is another tool I could mention. ADKAR is a useful tool to start as you're leading change. It asks you, that's an acronym. And somebody asked about, can we send the frameworks? I think we can follow up with I think we generally do a follow-up, right? So we can include some links in there. I'll remember to add ADKAR, but that tool acknowledges that there's abilities that we need to build through a strategy. And so, just kind of being open about that, like, yeah, we have to build certain capabilities. So that's one way at the start of the strategy. I think another is often I come back to the question of like, what are the results that the organization is unsatisfied with? That to me is a good grounding conversation, which then, hopefully calls back to like, well, this is why we're doing some strategy. But in the results that you're trying to get, that you're in pursuit of, there's generally learning associated with that. And so tying your overall, the big picture strategies to learning is another pathway to help close that gap.
Yeah, thank you. I would emphasize the sort of what do you want to learn? Why do you need to learn question? And that there's a self-interest here for everybody in the organization, right? There's a self-interest for the CEO and the president or the board and the senior staff and the other staff. Sort of, what do I need to learn to be able to do my job well? What do I need to learn to be successful in my job? And if your job is implementing the strategy, you want to learn how the strategy is doing so that you can do better in your job. If your self-interest here is so that you can, tell the board that you need more support in doing X, then you want to know how X is doing so that you can make the case for it. So there's something here about understanding the self-interests of different stakeholders so that you can connect the learning to that self-interest.
There's another question here. I'll prompt you to respond first, Kien, asking, could you say more about the flexibility and how that gets in the way of learning? Yeah. This was referenced earlier, when there's potentially too much flexibility.
So for me, the way I look at it when I think of too much flexibility is that the implementation of a strategy is there's room for it to flex and for people to do whatever they want to do. So what happens to me is that there isn't what's the word? There's no fidelity to the strategy and its implementation. I worked with a funder who had a strategy, and there were about probably 22 ways that they implemented the strategy across a state. And that was very difficult because there's no way to curate the learning because everybody was doing something different. So that was an example of having too much flexibility that you can't even curate the learning. I don't know if you have a different angle.
No, I think of it, so some people in those dynamics just point to lack of accountability, is another way of saying lack of fidelity is also where there aren't parameters, there aren't enough boundaries for what is the work we're focused on. There isn't enough clarity of direction, which sometimes people point to as like, oh, we don't have enough of accountability to the strategy, as one way too much flexibility shows up.
Yeah.
You want to say, I'll raise this question. As an evaluator, what is your role in supporting a transformation into a learning organization? That's good. I like that question.
Yeah. I'm thinking of a colleague of mine who recently talked about, and I think is writing about how the role of evaluators have really evolved over the past decade, from being sort of that traditional evaluator. You come in, you evaluate, you collect the data, you provide a report, and then you move on, to being more of a, you're inside an organization, you're helping the organization learn and apply the insights. I find personally that if I'm an evaluator who practices with equity at the center, then my role is not just an evaluator. My role is also a change agent, an educator, a critical friend. And that begins to get me into the space of helping an organization learn. So I don't think any organization can ever be perfect at focusing on equity and advancing equity, right? So if it's trying to achieve education equity, if it's trying to achieve health equity, it's always going to have to learn and do better. Like I said in the beginning in one of our slides, that there's no beginning or no end to it. So to me as an evaluator, it is part of my role to support an organization to become a learning organization and to apply those insights. Now, it may start with a project, the project you're evaluating, and hoping that that project team then applies that learning and that strategy. But ideally, I don't see how it can stop there, because I think whether a team learns in an organization is linked to whether the larger organization has a culture of learning and has a leadership that supports learning. So I don't think that as an evaluator, our role can stop just at the project. It's inevitable that you will have to move into the space of asking questions about the larger organization and its culture and trying to support that. I don't know if that's a good answer, but
no,
that's my experience to date.
Yeah. No, I'm also reminded of, in one of your slides, you said expect resistance. And we do too in our role as evaluators. Like, we expect resistance too. And so we're trying to navigate that in a way that helps, in a way, like to see ourselves as we're in a shared journey towards equity, which means that it's important that we're able to play that critical friend role. Which I think also just aligns with developmental evaluation. We
Yes.
like those opportunities where we are given the opportunity to try to support the capacity growth as well as evaluate.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we have about 7 minutes. I'm gonna take one question that we got from the registration. I'm unsure how much change I can create at the organizational level. Would love some insight around this. Yeah.
Yes. I can relate. And so great, great that you're here, right? And so one, yes, you can create change, and I do think it is contextual, right? How much change you can create. One, and I just say, just because we know that sometimes things that look impossible, right? It just, there's that phrase, it just takes a little longer than we thought, right? That is the story of all different change processes, right? There's times where it looks insurmountable, but it's a bigger struggle than we knew. So that's one thing. Yes, you can create change, but the level of change you can create, I do think, is contextual. I do think there are sometimes dynamics that cannot be overcome, right? Despite all sorts of different efforts, and despite our best intentions, despite the organization's best intentions, sometimes that is the case. And so I do think I suppose my approach with this is to align myself with as best I can with people who are in the struggle together, right? To make the experience feel where I'm not alone, right? Hugely important, whether that's inside the organization and outside, right? Getting support inside and outside, but also figuring. I suppose one other observation for me is that I've I mentioned I was part of a Cradle to Career initiative. There's a period in my career where I was absolutely focused on community level outcomes. That is what I was, in a way, obsessed with, right? Like everything was about community level outcomes. As I've gotten older, I suppose, right, and more experience, I have become way more focused on individual outcomes, and know that the two are connected. Know that the more that the investment of time with individuals leads to systemic change, but I'm have become much more satisfied in terms of spending time with individuals and teams, and building their capacity, and knowing that they're facing really hard conditions to move something forward, but it's meaningful. That is real change when we know that we are building the capacity of the people around us. Those are my initial thoughts. How about you, Kien?
Yeah, I agree with you. I do think that there's so many factors that affect how much change you can make in an organization, how much influence you have. And I've come at this point in my career and my experience, I've come to understand that it's setting realistic expectations for yourself, aligning your own capacity and your level of influence with the change you want to see, doing everything you can, and then letting go of what you know you can't do. I can't emphasize this enough, because I feel that for many people who want to make change, you can burn out very quickly. And we can't afford people who are really committed to making change towards equity to burn out. We just can't. There aren't enough of us, and we need every single one of us. So to me, it's balancing that self-care, knowing how much you can do, being able to let go with what you can't do and you don't have control over, and that it's okay if you know you've given everything you've got. And I agree with you. What you said resonated with me, Teak. There are some things that just can't be changed. There are some things that just have it takes more than one person to change it. And so then how do you look at, how do you engage with a group of allies who can then step back and go, where's the best place to push that lever of change? It may not be what you thought, but if you're in a community of people who can think that way, then it's likely that you can find the appropriate lever of change to push and not feel like you're doing it alone and trying to push that boulder up the hill.
That's great.
That's the best I can offer.
Yeah. Well, one more thought on this is that in my own last several years, have actually tried to express my commitment to equity outside of the workplace, right? And just and in my community, right? Where that actually felt more direct, and didn't give up on anything, but it was also like, when I encounter these barriers, I want to express my commitment in multiple ways, as opposed to just it was focusing too much on one. So that's been helpful too.
Yeah. Well, we're about 1 minute away, so I think we can end here. We will share the information today, and there's a package of information that goes out with the slide deck and some additional resource materials. I hope this was helpful. Really, the goal was just to begin to center the learning in the whole evaluation, learning, and continuous improvement framework, and to bring someone into this, into community science who has done a lot of learning work in the past. And again, as Teak said, I think the coaching role is really important. I myself find that coaching in organizations is a very valuable resource. And it's one of the ingredients, not tools, one of the ingredients, as Teak said, that should go into a whole recipe for how to support change in an organization. So thank you, Teak, for your time today. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, Steve.